This is the Nomad Futurist podcast, a podcast about the evolution of technology, society, and transformation. Connect with us, share your thoughts with us at nomadfuturist.com. Let's get this started. Here are Phil and Nabeel.
Hello. Welcome to Nomad Futurist. This is your co-host Nabeel Mahmood from Scottsdale, Arizona. Doesn't really sound right coming out of your mouth, Scottsdale, Arizona. This is your co-host Phillip Koblence from Montclair, New Jersey.
Hi, everybody. Stuart Lawrence. I'm here in Austin, Texas. As you can tell from the accent, not a South Texas accent. Originally,
You're stealing my lines.
Originally South African, and I was raised in the UK and found my way to the States around 2009.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to jump into the entire conversation on where you started, how you got started. But could you tell our audience at a high level about Stuart Lawrence? What does he do today?
Wear a lot of different hats, actually. So my background or education is in mechanical engineering. My parents would tell you that I came out of the womb as a mechanical engineer. I wanted to take everything apart and understand how it worked and the nuance of all the different things inside lighting and my toys and my father's lawnmower and all those sorts of things. But today I lead product innovation and sustainability at Stream Data Centers. And I actually originally came to Stream as part of the sort of due diligence customer cycle, responding to sort of tenant RFPs and things like that. And then the team asked me to sort of help work on the sustainability program. So I sort of built that out and then recently added to my team. So sort of offloading some of that work to focus on some of the product innovation and liquid cooling and things like that. Before Stream, I was at Schneider Electric for a few years and worked in the account management team on some of the larger customers and larger co-location providers. And before that, I was at Aligned Data Centers and sort of came in there working on the sales team, working on sales engineering, again, some product innovation. And so I've sort of circled the data center space probably for the last 13, 14 years. And I'll get into kind of the interesting story of how I got into it maybe a little bit later. But yeah, I worked for Montrose for a while as well.
So Stuart, you bring a very interesting point. I mean, you and I have had the opportunity of speaking in multiple conferences together and having fireside chats, so on and so forth. One of the things that I've actually never had the opportunity to ask you is the transition between manufacturing and being an end user. Could you speak to that just at a very high level? I mean, how has that transition been and what drove you to change?
So I came to the States in 2009 with Montrose. And while I was working at Montrose, they just acquired a company called Desham Technologies. And they were really, really interested in this sort of ongoing kind of change in the industry around economizer cooling and sort of the move from brute force applications to raising temperatures in data halls and kind of looking at it like that. And I was fascinated with my brother at the time was working for Microsoft and my father was working at IBM. And I was like, yeah, what you guys do is so cool and interesting. And then this opportunity came up with Montrose and sort of looking at and providing equipment for data centers. And so I sort of grabbed the opportunity and worked with guys like Keith Donovan and Mike Hurwald over at Montrose. And we sort of had a really good run. And while I was sort of working in that, Jake Kornemark from Aligned Energy at the time approached me and was like, hey, we're looking for folks that are interested in data centers and understand the mechanical systems and can help explain some of these things to customers. And I was like, wow, moving from a manufacturer to an actual end user, that wasn't even something I'd considered, but it was pretty attractive. And at the time, engineers were paid pretty lowly and some of these numbers were quite attractive. And it drove me to take the opportunity. And of course, the learning curve then it was astronomical, right? I was going from just a very small niche part of mechanical engineering, economizing and things to understanding the whole scope of a data center in terms of power and distribution. And, the cooling doesn't just stop at the fan wall or the CRA. It actually has to traverse chilled water pipes and go through pumps and chillers. And then we're talking about evaporative assist and all sorts of different things. So that was probably the real sort of rocket, if you want to call it, of me going from manufacturing to sort of really being involved in the data center and then talking to clients. And then that's evolved in now to talking to investors and sort of explaining the nuances of what makes certain data center developments attractive. So it's been a whirlwind since about 2016 when I sort of took that leap of faith to go and work at Aligned.
I think in general, the perspective on digital infrastructure and data centers traditionally is that, oh, you must be some geeky computer guy that was a computer programmer or designed websites or design applications or what have you. And as the needs have evolved, it has become so much more about the construction and how you distribute power and how you cool all of that load. And it's still, I mean, even in the way you tell the transition to the data center, it feels fairly obfuscated from actual compute. And did that surprise you about the transition? Do you expect it to be more computer focused when this data center company came to you and said, we need help with this stuff? Did you think, oh my God, this is going to be a massive shift from the mechanical engineering, only to get there and realize, oh my God, these guys need cooling, a lot of it?
Not really, honestly, because I had done a lot of work. I'd supported some co-location companies and I supported some hyperscalers. And so I sort of already had an understanding of, while I was at Munchers, we'd sold systems to these providers and users, right? And so I sort of had a good understanding of what was going on in a data center already. I hadn't really had exposure to how the systems worked. I just knew my little swim lane, right? I was like, hey, we have to provide economizer cooling to these guys, and they don't really understand this. They're used to cooling these data walls to 55 degrees, and now they're saying, hey, it's 75 degrees, and we're using outside air in some form or fashion. So that was my sort of nuance or my little swim lane, right? And then all of a sudden moving and, I was exposed to all of these other ideas and these other sort of facets. Now, did I really understand the size of the scope change? Not really. Now, that part of it definitely caught me by surprise in terms of how interrelated the systems were. Because you always sort of seem to think, oh, my swim lane is just my swim lane and it doesn't really impact everybody else, right? And actually, as the data centers have grown and the scale of the problem has become so much bigger, the interrelationship has become much more focused. But something you touched on that I think is interesting, what I probably didn't really understand is sort of the lack of available human capital staff in these scenarios, right? People that understand all these different components are like gold needles in haystacks. I mean, like, whatever path you take, whatever way you can get in and kind of whatever interests you, I think is the way to get in and go for it. But you're going to get exposed to so much more. And once you are exposed to so much more, then you become a red bird. And that's worth.
And I think that's the magic, right? The magic is trying to at least recognize the fact that the traditional approach to career pathways were that, Nabeel calls it staying in a swim lane or compartmentalization or silos or whatever you want to call it, where this is what I'm doing. But no matter what direction you go, particularly in a data center, there's such a, as you describe it, codependent ecosystem of the compute and the connectivity and the cooling and the power distribution. And the more things get bigger and bigger, the more interdependent they are. Once you get to liquid cooled chips and immersion and whatever, and it's only continuing to go in that direction. And if you can capture that, and what we're trying to do with the foundation, obviously, is give people that kind of 30,000 foot view of not just the blinking lights and the applications and how they're used, but how all of the underlying infrastructure actually comes together to kind of magically create a perfect world in which this digital infrastructure exists.
And then on top of that, right, outside of just the interrelation of the mechanical, electrical construction, building components, right, the energy services, sustainability, I mean, those things are monumental in their own right. And for me, like, I came in as this mechanical engineer focused on cooling and changing the world from an efficiency standpoint and PUE and WE and looking at the data center in one very small part. And now all of a sudden I'm involved with designing sustainability programs and working on ESG and thinking about the human capital and talent attraction and retention and programmatic training and health and safety and cybersecurity and like energy procurement or renewable energy or all these different things. I could never have dreamed that I would have been doing those types of things, but it's amazing how you can leverage different skill sets to build on and help support different other parts of the business.
And that's really critical, right? I mean, as you said, we are those unicorns in the sector right now that can intelligently have a conversation across multiple domains within our space, whereby it's a dominoes effect, right? I mean, if we try to fix one thing and it doesn't work the way we planned it, it's a dominoes effect that 20 other people downstream are going to be affected. So that's brilliant. I think you said it very eloquently. Going back to early part of your life, you mentioned that you were born a mechanical engineer. now. But we did hear that your dad and your brother are technologists as well.
Right.
Was that the root of it, or where did you get your passion and interest to be that mechanical engineer to break things and build things?
Probably from my father. I mean, both my father and my brother are on the IT side, the networking architecture type side. So for me, that's all just in the ether, right? Like, I certainly claim not to be a network architecture or electrical engineer. That stuff's like black magic to me. But
Just like what you do is likely black magic to them.
yeah, right. Yeah. Psychometrics and humidity control, right? Yeah. No, but from a very young age, my father tinkered with everything as well. And I was always walking around with one of his tools in my hand or stealing a screwdriver or something like that. So I think that exacerbated it, right? It allowed it to evolve and blossom into sort of something that was passionate. Having said that, I didn't really think about engineering actually sort of going up, finishing high school and going to college. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do when I did sort of go to college. I knew I wanted to go to university and sort of further my education, but I didn't realize that engineering was going to be the path. What actually initially I was like, oh, I'll go and look at medicine because I had a family member who was a doctor, and I spent like a week at a pre-med school in the Midlands in the UK, Nottingham University, and they had a cadaver on a table one day, and that was the end of my interest in medicine. And after that, I'd written all my essays and entrance requirements around medicine and other things. And I was like, oh my God, I've got to scramble here. And I was kind of having frank, honest conversations with my brother and my parents. And you've always just liked mechanical systems and things like that. And the kind of penny dropped right there, actually. And that's why I ended up then applying to engineering schools around the UK. And I ended up going to Exeter, and I never turned back. I loved every moment of it.
So during your teenage years, your career pathway come as something you consider in your conversations with your parents? Or that was it when you were done with your levels? Okay, this is it. I'm probably going to go in this direction.
I was a little bit wishy-washy, I think, through my high school and early or A levels, I guess, in the UK. So end of high school, kind of college.
A wishy-washy teenager. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, I mean, pretty consistent, right? And that's probably, when I talk to, we've got neighbors and friends who have high school age kids, and they're like, oh, you're doing great, and it looks like you're having a great time and you love your career. Like, what would the advice be? And I'm saying, well, I didn't get here in a very linear fashion, and it wasn't this road of beer and skittles or wine and roses, right? There were a lot of times where my family, we joke about stomping the grapes. Sometimes you have to stomp the grapes, and other times you get to drink some wine, right? But there's been a lot of stomping grapes along that path, doing jobs that I thought I was stuck in and had to kind of force myself to get out of the comfort zone for things to happen. And certainly the early part of my career was very much that way. But, and again, I only moved into data centers and this sort of stuff in 2009. From the time I graduated in 2001 to 2009, I had 2 or 3 other jobs, which were in very, very mundane, boring industries, although associated with mission critical in some sense, hospital ORs and power stations and other, I would consider to be mission critical type applications. They were more of a treasury type role. But I think the foundation is what kind of stayed, right? I mean, I'm very inquisitive. I like to know how things work. And so I'll go and read up about it. I'll tap Nabeel or someone else on the shoulder and be like, hey, you've done something like this. How does this work? What are the nuances? Who should I talk to? What should I read about? Right. So that's the part that I tell people is just stay inquisitive, like be curious, continue to try and learn a little bit about it, even if it's not your subject matter. And in this industry, the likelihood is you're going to get that exposure. And if you have a curiosity and a willingness to kind of get into it, you never know where it's going to lead. You might be running a sustainability program as an engineer in a year's time. So it's,
that's I say it probably too often on the show that curiosity didn't work out for the cat very well, but it is absolute magic in our industry. Is your brother older? How much older?
He's like 8 years older.
Right.
Yeah.
So
And it's just the two of you, I guess.
No, I have a younger brother too. He's in the Middle East right now working on like aquaculture stuff. He's a marine biologist and aquaculture technologist.
Yeah, your parents really created 3 real dum-dums. But that spread, similar, I got into this industry. I had a brother who was 7 years older than me, which is a fairly large spread. And I was able to see him, not necessarily in the technology industry, but following technology stocks. He came in through finance and ended up being exposed to technology. Was your father at IBM that entire time? I mean, clearly you were exposed to the stuff that lives in data centers, if not data centers directly. Even if
Yeah,
not,
he was, so my father actually started his career as a commercial airline pilot. So he was in aviation until I was, I think, in my 7 to 10 time frame. And he was doing long hauls. This was early 80s. And then through a whole confluence of different situations, he decided to change career. And his father had been like a CFO of some manufacturing companies, and he'd ended up working for his father and kind of getting a different career path, but being much more interested in factory automation, optimization. And then as computers started coming out early 80s, late 80s, you started to see more sort of factory management, production inventory management, all going to database, going to
like the original prehistoric AI, like the
that
automation.
Yeah, right. And so that was his path, and that led from one thing to another. We immigrated to the UK in 93, and then that led from those types of inventory management, production, scheduling, all that kind of stuff into networking. And he ended up becoming like a TCP/IP network architecture sort of fundy. And
even though he says TCP/IP, it sounds like he still thinks it's black magic. It's the things that blink. It's the things that blink.
Right, exactly. Exposed to it on the fringe. I didn't really understand what it all meant and how it was being applied. And the funny thing is, I talked to my dad, and I was obviously retired, and I talked to him about what's going on in the data center, and we're planning for 130 kilowatts a rack and hundreds of kilowatts, megawatts per row. And it boggles his mind, because not even 10 years ago, he was working on 1 to 2 to 3 kilowatts per rack. And they were talking about 5 to 7. And he was like, when are we going to go to 5 to 7 kilowatts a rack? And like, how does that network architecture work? And now we're at orders of magnitude.
It just blinks faster, Dad. It just blinks faster.
Yeah.
Or prints money faster, Dad. Well, I think one of the points that you make is very interesting. The skill set that's transferable. Like, he had the finance exposure, got involved in aviation. Again, there's a very technical element to being a pilot. And then moving from there to the controls, automation, and networking piece. So it's important to have that exposure for the young minds, because that's going to define their direction. I mean, probably your level of interest and curiosity was driven by seeing your father and your brother that led you to be the mechanical engineer, not a doctor, and then go deeper and wider within an organization and or initiatives that you're engaged in.
I think about it all the time, Nabeel. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old now, and I think about it all the time in terms of what is that influence, the nature versus nurture. What is that influence that happened to me that made me curious, and how do you train that, right? And I mean, to me, like you said, we're fortunate in the positions that we've been put in, but we found ourselves too here. But a lot of it was probably driven out of our curiosity, is to continue to sort of keep digging and get involved. And how do you, even, young folks in the organization, how do you kind of get them to take the blinkers off and see the bigger picture and kind of get involved in these different things, and not be scared to fail? Because when you step out of that little niche that you feel like you're an expert in, and you're in another niche now, you're going to say things that sound silly, and the experts are going to be like, oh, that wasn't quite right. But help you out. I think we are in a good industry in the sense that the experts don't shoot you down. They tend to, because of the lack of human capital, they tend to try and encourage people, because we want them to stay, and we want more people in the industry. It's really hard to find.
It's also such a young industry that the experts today were morons a few years ago, right? So it's really difficult to suggest I'm a huge expert when the thing I'm an expert in didn't exist 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's not like you can say, there are really, really expert plumbers out there, because the concept of plumbing hasn't necessarily shifted significally over the course of the last 100 years, since pipes.
1,000 years, probably.
The wheel. There are experts in wheels, because the wheel was invented a while back. But in our world, I think we recognize how quick innovation has been, and we're kind of at the beginning of this thing. It feels like it's been going on forever. Certainly when I look in the mirror, I'm like, where did all the hair go? But it's really a fairly short period of time that this industry has even existed. So
even as an expert, you can't rest on your laurels, because in 6 months to a year, you probably aren't going to be one anymore.
No doubt. And I think from my standpoint, I think what we try to do with the foundation is try to just expose folks to this industry, because I think kids in general, especially now, because they grow up with you have a 4 and a 6-year-old. I have a 7 and 11-year-old. They've grown up with an iPhone in their hand. The iPad was their nanny, right? So
well, my oldest knows how to command Google, and he's asking Google for all sorts of things all the time when he comes home.
right. And so the pathological fascination with technology is embedded in them. So if we can show them the world where all of this stuff lives that enables that at an early age, then they might be more naturally attracted to some level, some area of our industry where their perspective on how technology works is really the magic and not like specific knowledge.
Yeah, but I think, and I love what you guys do as well with the foundation. I think it's also incumbent upon us to have more outreach, right? I think part of what the data industry has been lacking is that community engagement. And I think we're going to get burned at some point if we don't do this. If we don't, where we're building infrastructure and where we're putting large capital to work, not just from an energy standpoint, but we need folks to operate those sites. We need folks to design them. We need folks to support all the facets from sustainability and energy and finance and material science and things like that. So there's a certain amount of outreach that now has to happen because we're struggling to fill those jobs. And I think it just makes a lot of sense to do it at the community level within the facilities that we're putting billions and billions of dollars of capital to work. So,
yeah, brilliant.
That's one.
Well, thank you. So that was a great plug-in, by the way. And a couple of things that I would like to add to it. You mentioned not being smart enough or not asking intelligent questions. I think every question is intelligent. And the pace that the technology is evolving, we don't have all the answers. So it's great to have those not so smart questions because it enables us to step back and take the blinders off. Or maybe we're not thinking about it the right way. Maybe there is a different way to solve that problem or the situation. At what point in time during your career you got exposed to the data center sector and you made that transition? And what drove you to make that transition?
Yeah, it was 2009, 2010. I'd moved from the UK to the US and I was working just a lot of commercial HVAC stuff for Montrose, and they acquired the Deschamps Technologies component, and I kind of got introduced internally to some of the folks there. And that was really the spark of interest in, I know a little bit about data centers. I know what's going on there, more so from the network IT side, right? But how do we integrate? Like, what are we doing in data centers? And I'll be honest here, I didn't recognize that 1 kilowatt hour of power into the data center equals 1 kilowatt hour of heat out at the time. I just thought there was some overlay of cooling or something. And so that's kind of what drove me, the interest, what sort of captured me and kind of got me sort of thinking about it. And then once I was in, obviously there was a good amount of success, right? Because data centers were sort of transitioning from these north of 2.5 PUE facilities, brute force, meat locker temperatures, to ASHRAE had published, TC99 had published thermal guidelines that were talking about temperatures that were in the 70s and X factors that allowed machines to operate much higher temperatures and not really for shorter periods of time. And it was really about sort of silicon memory. And that sort of started the ball rolling, and was the snowball effect for me. But we had a lot of good success. And out of that success, I think what happened was data center companies started taking more interest in these more fringy engineering and science folks that like, wait, we're having a hard time getting people in. Let's try and pull some of these people in. And I kind of got sucked in as part of that. And Jake was very, very compelling when he said, come work with me at Aligned. And we looked at all sorts of cool, interesting stuff and geothermal, Rankine cycle engines to power these things. And we were evaluating different types of ways to cool. And they kind of were ahead of their time at that specific moment in time. And it took a little bit of time to sort of catch fire from a leasing perspective, but my goodness, did they do that?
What I've always loved about this industry is a kind of, no matter what you think is going on, you could always just turn it on its head. And it only takes that slight perspective. I mean, why are we walking through a data center and the temperature of it is being dictated by someone in a suit that's walking through it that has this preconceived notion that it should be cold in here because I was told it should be cold in here. Why are we not asking the machines what temperature they want? We're recognizing that inside the machine it's really hot. And if you put super cold air in front of it, you're creating a weather pattern inside the machine that is not probably in the best interest of the compute infrastructure.
And the same thing could be said for liquid cooling, right? We're now at this huge transitional disruption phase in data center. I think this is probably one of the biggest disruptors I've seen since I've been in it, but I think probably in the last 30 years, I think probably since the x86 was sort of adopted, right? But I mean, this transition, and by the way, liquid cooling has been around since the IBM mainframe days, right? But the advent of the high heat flux, these 1200 watt GPUs now, where they literally can't be air cooled, that's been knocking on the door for a while. And I think now Pandora's box is open, right? I think with the silicon companies, OEMs, recognizing that they now have the ability to take those next steps, and these solutions are going to become mainstream, I think we're going to see the even more of an acceleration towards that.
You're basically conflating the two. You're turning the entire thing is now a piece of mechanical equipment, as opposed to those two things.
Well, it's more integrated.
Yeah.
It poses a pretty big problem for data center operators, because beforehand, your DMARC was the data hall, and we said, hey, we provide the right amount of air for every kilowatt of power you've got in that data hall, and we'll absorb the heat over here and we'll send it over there. But now our fluid medium is literally touching their IT, and there isn't that separation or demarcation. And so I think it becomes more challenging. There's more opportunity for disruption in terms of changes in science and approaches of thinking things through differently. So I'm actually really excited to see this unfold. Are we going to make some pretty colossal mistakes? I'm sure we are. I mean, we're already hearing about contamination events and things like that. I don't think we'll make thermal mistakes. I think we'll kind of cope with the thermal aspect pretty well. But it's the unseen stuff that we're going to have to kind of muddle through.
Spoken like a true mechanical engineer, that he'll never screw up thermal. It's the computer. Somehow. Yeah. 10 years in meeting and talking about cryogenics in the data center to support quantum computing workloads. But thankfully, we don't have to worry about that.
Well, it's all right. We've been to
people ask me that all the time, right? They're like, when does quantum replace all of this? And I'm like, well, when we figure out how to create superconductors that don't need liquid nitrogen to operate, we'll probably be there. But I mean, everything has its place, right? Supercomputers have their place, and liquid cooling had its place even 10 years ago in those sorts of places. But I think at least for probably the next 5-10 years, for what I would consider foreseeable future, I think we're going to be going gangbusters, building out more and more capacity. And I think AI, to me, everyone's talking about AI and how much power, and I actually think it's the knock-on effect of what AI is doing to cloud services and data from a perspective of the end user, mom and pop or enterprise business. They're using AI to sort of understand and learn more about their business and the data that they have. And that's just creating inordinate amounts of
people rarely talk about AI as an accelerant. But in reality, it's an accelerant of compute workloads.
And if you were an enterprise company operating on-prem with maybe a small cloud instance and some co-location, now your strategy is on its head. Because beforehand, you were like, I don't really need that much cloud. I kind of use my cloud instance to be able to operate application level across that sphere. And now you have to have a bigger cloud instance if you really want access to these AI tool sets. Because if you don't, you're now massively disadvantaged against your competitors who are going heavy into those instances. So that's probably what's happening. There's a lot of that going on, I think.
Yeah. Besides the human capital deficit that you talked about, the challenges there are, what are some of the other challenges that you see in our sector that need to be addressed today?
Oh, look, we're going to have huge energy issues, right? I think we're seeing that already. I think the delay between when really sort of small cell nuclear comes online or nuclear comes online, I think there's going to be an intermittent period where we're going to have some serious scope 1 emissions to deal with. And how do we kind of get our arms around that and address it? And all the biggest companies in the world are trying to decarbonize, right? We all have net zero of 2030, 2040, 2050 decarbonization strategies to net zero or negative. And the energy challenge right now is a big one that I think, look, we're all hyper-focused on it at the moment, coupled with supply chain, and those two things are quite inextricably linked as well. None of that gets solved without the people. I mean, that's the most fundamental thing that we're really lacking. And I think the cost component the human capital is going to skyrocket. I mean, it's already really challenging. I think it's going to skyrocket. And that's going to have to get baked into all the financial models.
So besides the primary markets like America and the UK, are there any other markets that you think are going to start scaling up rapidly here?
I have an internal debate about that one all the time. I mean, we just see such huge absorption happening in North America and Europe. And I, obviously, having been born in South Africa, I'd ideally love to see Africa come along. And I know it's growing.
It is, yeah.
It's growing rapidly, but in the context of the global market, it's probably still some way behind. And more so there than anywhere else, probably will be more challenged by the human capital training, education, technology, understanding than the rest of the world, right? I mean, yes, it's going to be expensive to get those folks in the US and North America, and it's going to continue to get to drive to higher cost. But in Africa, you're trying to find those people where they don't exist. You literally have to try and poach them from the rest of the world. And so that's probably where a lot of that has to happen. They're going to have access to equipment and that side of things. But I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it totally did. I think one of the challenges, of course, beyond just having the human capital to be able to develop all over the planet, because there's no place. People used to ask me where the edge lives, and I used to tell them like the world is a sphere, right? And inevitably there is no edge because the edge is everywhere. But you also have to reconcile that with the fact that you need those local communities to be on board with this type of development. And you want that kind of an appreciation of the local culture beyond just like the logistics of it and the need for it and et cetera. Right. And I think what I try to suggest to anyone that I speak to is that their perspective with how technology is used, perspective with how digital infrastructure is inevitably used, is born out of their lived experience. It's not really born out of what type of specific knowledge they have, because that's always evolving, that's always changing. But until we can export this, just the concept of what this industry is to all of those places, it's going to be really difficult to see a pathway where we can continue to grow on the same basis that we need to in order to keep up with all of the data that we're inevitably growing.
Yeah, and if you don't do the work at the front end of a development, right, to engage the community, and I'm not going to be taking all your water, and we're going to be bringing services, and we're going to be adding, capacity for things that you're interested in, and we're going to partner on wastewater, and we're going to be bringing additionality and renewable energy and more reliable services, and so there's a lot of things that can be spun to a positive or be looked at as a positive when data infrastructure comes to a geography. And I think it's important to do that at the front end and maybe build some of these training programs and things at the front end before you even start breaking ground, right? I mean, we're trying very hard to do that in the geographies we're working in. So, and I know most of our peer group are doing that. One thing I didn't touch on, Nabeel, I think is, and my rationale behind why a lot of the absorption's happening in those bigger markets is this data gravity idea, and AI is only exacerbating it, right? It's like, hey, the bigger the data set I have to be able to compute, the more I'm going to learn out of it. And that inherently creates more of an attraction to larger data sets. And so I think we're sort of seeing that. Now, we're seeing those compute GPU clusters being put out where land is cheap and power is cheap and water is available and things like that. But I still see a trend, at least. I never really bought into the edge idea, by the way. I was kind of always like, well, hold on, I can do it at a much better competitive price over here in a bigger cluster. I understood the latency argument, and I think that still is going to come around. But like you said, Philip, I mean, the edge is everywhere now. You're milliseconds away from a large cluster wherever you stand in the US, pretty much.
What's that edge is about a data center. It's not that. It's not, right? I mean, the cloud is the data centers. There's nothing up in the ether, folks. It's in a data center in a physical building somewhere around the world.
Right.
And like you said earlier, you talk about internally how all of those systems are interrelated, the power and the cooling and the compute. If you take that 30, maybe you go from 10,000 feet to 30,000 or 50,000 foot view and recognize that while we as an industry talk about IoT in a bucket and hyperscale in a bucket and AI in a bucket, we are creative, like all of them are interrelated. The more IoT we have in autonomous vehicles and wearable health things and refrigerators that tell us when we need milk and all of these things, the more of that stuff we have, the more of all of the other things we need to learn from that data and then process that data and then deliver your packages in 10 minutes from the time that you thought of it.
Right.
Right.
Just kind of steal the moniker from, what was it, probably 10 years ago when we were talking about hyper-converged. We were kind of converging memory and storage and network processing power all under one package. Now we're doing that across the ether, like across the scale. Everything is kind of hyper-converged all the time. So
Brilliant. So Stuart, what's next for you?
what's next? I'm thrilled to be a part of the Stream Data Centers team. We're fortunate to be working with the largest players in the world. And so my eyes are being opened to new, interesting things all the time. And I'm getting to have a part in our design and work on solving these liquid cooling challenges, and with an eye on sustainability and how that affects decarbonization strategy at the component level all the way through the data center. And it's not just about concrete and steel, right? So I'm having a ball. I mean, I'm having a great time. For me, I think some of the focus, and that's probably just because I'm getting older, is just sort of thinking about giving back and kind of how to participate in bringing the next people, the next teams in. And so I've started, as part of my sustainability role, getting more exposure to this sort of community engagement and some of the training and working with colleges and things that Stream has started to sort of participate in. So that's fun. And my alma mater are always reaching out to me as well. Sort of, hey, can you do a presentation on this? Or can you get involved in this? We're going to be at this part of the world. And we've got sister and brother colleges kind of working on things. So that's fun for me now. And we've done well financially. And so that affords you the ability to sort of start thinking about giving back more.
Well, I guess we found another ambassador, Phil.
Yeah. I mean, if only there was a foundation whose mission was aligned with that purpose.
Hey, I've been waiting for this invite for a long time.
It's here. The time is upon us. If there was a virtual way for me to knight you, I would say you are knighted.
Sir Stuart Lawrence. That sounds pretty good to me. So based on what you know today,
Yep.
would you have started the data center part of your career early on? Was you waited? What would you tell the younger Stuart Lawrence?
Yeah,
Don't be so scared of cadavers. That's what I would tell him.
Yeah. Had that been an engineering lab and maybe T stuff, I probably still would have been scared away with the bits and bytes. And I meant programming and C+ and Python and all that stuff never really excited me. So the path I came to data centers and the timing of it was perfect for me. Honestly, I don't know had I those years that I was stomping the grapes, as it were, in the early 2000s, would I have changed something? Probably not. I didn't know enough about it, and the exposure hadn't kind of really captured my imagination. Sure. Would it have made a difference in my career path? Probably, right? Earlier exposure, I mean, the opportunity now as a result of having that early exposure in the 90s and 2000s is just dramatic. So, but no, I'm happy with the path I've taken and wouldn't change much.
What would you tell the younger Stuart Lawrence based on what we know today, where the future is? And is it something that they should invest in and get exposed to?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Stay curious, invest your time in digging into these things. It's great to be an expert in a very nuanced field, but I think it's really important to be a jack of all trades, or somewhat have a little of an understanding of the interrelationship between all the different facets. And it, like we said at the start, right, they're becoming more and more dependent on each other. So even though you might think you're not that important, you're becoming much more important and central to the whole story. So what would I tell myself? Just keep that curiosity and keep taking opportunities, right? Don't just sit back and think, well, this one's not really for me, or maybe they'll find someone better. Those better people aren't out there. You're all the good stuff. You're it. So grab the opportunities with both hands. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Probably part of my downfall, or at least what I could have done better, is like most mechanical engineers, you think you know it all, but I probably could have done better as I'm still curious, but I tended to be curious, like, that's interesting. I'll go and learn about it in my own time, rather than being front and center and saying, hey, can you explain that to me? Or this seems like this works like that. And I'd have tended to sort of shy away a little bit and then go and figure it out and come back and try and apply and learn. But I think just get stuck in there and then.
Well, that's great advice. Absolutely. No, I think being curious and being vulnerable, that's the most important thing, right? Don't be the smartest guy in the room, because no one is. Ask questions, and it's okay to ask silly questions. probably might help somebody. I mean, one of the things that really clearly comes out of this conversation is exposure and experience and education, right? Early exposure is important because that will help drive that curiosity. We know we are using this technology stack, but how does it work and why does it work and where does it reside? Nobody talks about that. I mean, with the whole idea of cloud, it's not up in the ether. It's in a physical data center somewhere. Edge, the earth is not flat. At least have not been able to find that edge.
That could be controversial in some circles.
Yeah.
Edge is in a data center. It's just how we're moving the compute, how are we moving data. It's those definitions that need to be overly simplified for an average person to connect or relate to.
Yep. How do we continue to proliferate that information, right? How do we convey that there's so many facets to this and you can take an interest in anything and kind of find your way in? And then also, how do we motivate the senior guard or the folks in our industry to kind of mentor people and participate in learning stuff, even if it's a small amount of time, right? That knowledge is so valuable and it needs to somehow find its way into the younger generation.
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, right? I think what we're trying to do with the foundation is, I think we say this all the time, right? Everyone's heart is in the right place. I think our industry, more than most, we love sharing information because we really find this stuff cool. And what we're trying to do is try to kind of create a path that people can go, create this aggregation of knowledge that will give people the ability to get in front of the younger generation, get in front of people that are genuinely curious.
For me, time is the hardest problem to solve for, right? And so all of us, as the market becomes more and more constrained, the less and less time we all have. And so then how do you give back or how do you contribute when you just have no time, right? And so that, I think that's really interesting. That part of the equation is just sort of solving for how do we get snippets of content from people that know things about certain subject matter into a platform that can be delivered without impacting that person's time.
Right. And that's what we're attempting to do, right? Disseminate that kind of institutional knowledge that we have in ways that can be understood by folks that are not living in our world every day.
Yeah, I think, as it entails the time, that is a challenge. We just have to make it. I think we have to figure out a way to convert a 24-hour day into a 28-hour day. There is something out there.
We have the technology.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, hopefully if somebody finds those extra 4 hours, please do let us know. We'll make sure that every leader in the technology sector knows about that. Stuart, this has been amazing.
I flew back from Vegas yesterday. It was a 4-hour flight, but time zones made it 7 hours. So if you go the other way, it also works. So I guess time zones.
Just
keep going west. Keep going west.
That's what Superman did. And the thing that he went back in time is perfect.
Brilliant. Stuart, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. Impactable story, great journey. Thank you for sharing that with our audience. It's been lovely hosting you on the podcast.
No, pleasure. Thank you very much. Appreciate all the things that you guys are doing and onwards and upwards, right? We have lots of work to do.
No doubt.
This has been great. Nothing lasts forever. Markets will come back, currencies will rebound, businesses will go on, and we will all move on. That could happen next week, next month, or next year. At Nomad Futurist, we're confident that those who prepare rather than panic will come out of this stronger. Thank you for joining us. This has been brought to you by Nomad Futurist. Check us online at nomadfuturist.org. And thank you for listening and subscribing, as well as your continued support.